The perpetual shadow over Ure worked in Zael's favor as he climbed toward Gregus Matsi's mountain sanctum, even though the former monastery faced away from much of the city below. Enough of a line of sight existed that would have made it quite simple in daylight for anyone to spot the cloaked form winding its way up the half-broken path carved into the rock face. Zael could appreciate the location the sorcerer had chosen, and wondered why he had never noticed the ruins of it earlier. The spell that had taken a spirit form of Ure and cast it heavenward had interesting touches to it that he hoped later to investigate. Below him, the celebrating continued unabated. Zael frowned. Do the people require no sleep? True, the realm of Limbo did not fall under the same laws as the mortal plane, but surely by now, exhaustion should have taken many of the inhabitants. Huge, ominous forms stood guard as he at last reached what passed for a gateway to the monastery. Once, there had been archangels with majestic blazing swords and massive outstretched wings, but, like their counterparts on the doors of Khan's palace, these had been heavily damaged. One angel missed an entire wing and the right side of its face. The other had no head at all, and only stubs where the once magnificent plumed appendages had risen. Zael crawled over rubble, finding it interesting that Gregus Matsi's abode remained so ruined when all else in Ure had been restored to new. The necromancer could only assume that the people of the cursed city had taken out their anger at some point on the abode of their absent tormentor. Zael only hoped that this did not mean that Matsi's sanctum had been ransacked. He wished again that he knew more about the ways of the realm in which Ure had been trapped. Khan hinted that a semblance of the passage of time did exist, for had he not talked of researching a method of escape during those centuries of imprisonment? Yet it seemed that no one had needed to eat, for certainly the food could not have lasted very long. What remained of the monastery itself did not initially impress Zael. Thrust out of the very side of the mountain, the unassuming outline indicated only a two-story block design structure that could have held more than two rooms to a level. A small balcony overlooked all below, and only a low wall pretended to give any protection whatsoever to the place. Despite some disappointment in what he had found so far, the necromancer continued on. At the base of the building, he found a plain wooden door, the likes of which might have decorated a simple country inn. His eyesight far better suited to the dark than most humans, Zael made out damage on every side of the doorway. Someone had used axes and clubs to batter every inch of the stone frame, almost as if in absolute frustration. Oddly, though, the door itself looked absolutely untouched. It took only the placing of his hand on the wood to discover why. A complex series of protective spells crisscrossed all over, making the door itself virtually impenetrable, not only to physical attack, but even to many forms of magical assault. The stone frame, which had suffered some superficial cracks, also had spells cast over it, but those fell older, as if not laid upon it quicker by its last and most infamous tenant. Zael's estimate of the monastery as a place for a sorcerer to live rose. The monks who had built it had evidently strengthened it through some very powerful prayers, if even after all this time most of the wards held. Looking up, the necromancer found no visible windows. In one place, it appeared as if there had once been a window, but in the past it had been covered up quite thoroughly with stone. Sile assumed that if he climbed up and investigated it, he would find the former opening as well shielded as the entrance. that left only the door as a way inside. The pale spellcaster touched it again, sensing the myriad binding Gregis Matsi had set into place to ensure the safety of his sanctum. The ancient sorcerer had clearly been very adept at his art. Zael pulled Hombart's skull free. Tell me, what do you see? Besides the door, you mean? You know what I want from you. He thrust the skull closer to the entrance, letting it survey everything. After a few moments, Humbart said, "There's lines all over here, boy. Some good strong magic here, and not at all by one person. Most of it is, but there's underlining lines that had to have been from two, even three, even some prayer work too. One interesting feature concerning the skull that the necromancer had discovered after animating it had been that the spirit of Humbart Wessel could now see the workings of magic in ways no living spellcaster could. Zael had no references upon which to draw for a reason for this ability, and could only assume that the many centuries of having lain near the ruins of Ure had somehow changed the skull. Over the past few years, the talent had come in quite handy, saving Zael hours, even days of painstaking work. With his other hand, the black-clad figure removed the ivory dagger, hilt held up. He asked Humbar, "Where do most intersect?" "Down to the left, boy. Waist level. No, not there. More to the right. Stop." Pointing the hilt at the spot the skull had indicated, Zayo muttered under his breath. The dagger began to glow. Suddenly, a multicolored pattern reminiscent of a hexagon within a flower burst into existence at the point specified. Still whispering, Zael thrust the hilt into the exact center, at the same time turning the end of the dagger in a circular motion. The magical pattern flashed bright, then instantly faded away. You cleared much of it, lad. There's still a little locking to do, though. With Humbart's fleshless head to guide him, Zael gradually removed the last impediments. Had he been forced to rely on his own skills alone, he doubted that he would have had such quick success. The words had been skillfully woven together. However, one advantage the necromancer had discovered had been that the most cunning had been set to guard against demons, not men. Questioning the skull revealed that the majority of those had been created more recently, which likely pointed to Gregis Matsi as their caster. You can walk right in now, Humbart finally announced. The skull in the nook of one arm and the dagger now held ready for more mundane use. Zail stepped inside. A darkened hall greeted him. The necromancer muttered a word, and the blade of the dagger began to glow. Zael had thought Matzi's sanctum rather small, but now he saw he had been sorely mistaken. The empty hall led deep into the mountainside, so deep that he could not even see the end. To his left, a set of winding steps obviously led to the more visible portion of the structure. Josiah only had interest in where the corridor ahead ended. True, he might have been able to find what he needed in the outer rooms, but the spellcaster's curiosity had been piqued. What secrets had Gregis Matsi left behind? With the dagger lighting the way, Zael headed down the hall. The walls had been patiently carved from bedrock, then polished fine. However, the same monks who had no doubt performed the back-breaking work had not been bothered much with adornment. Now and then the fluttering figure of an armed archangel pointed farther ahead, but other than that, neither the monks nor Matsi had bothered to decorate further. Zael paused at the third such image, so lovingly carved, suddenly noticing something about it. Humbart, still in his arm, grew impatient. I'm staring at a blank wall inches from where my nose used to be, Zael. Lad, is there anything more interesting above? The cloaked figure raised the skull so that his dead companion could see. It is untouched. And that would mean. Think about it, Humbart. The doors of the palace, the archangels at the gateway leading here, all purposely damaged, as if by those who hated such holy images. I. And so. Moving to the next angel, Zael saw that it, too, remained in pristine condition. Why would so corrupt a mage as Gregis Mossi has been claimed to be leave these untouched? Maybe he didn't want to make a mess in his own good home. This means something, Humbart. But what it meant exactly, the necromancer did not know. He pushed on, glancing at some of the other heavenly guides, yet none more had more than a slight weathered look to it. No, Mossi had not wreaked harm on any of those images within his own abode, and that made no sense to Zael. They came at last across the first rooms actually carved into the mountain, rooms the last tenant had clearly not bothered much to use. Little remained of any furnishings. A few very old beds sat lonely in the far corners of some, the wood slowly rotting away. Some had already collapsed. Old Gregis never struck me as a sociable sort, Humbart commented quietly. Looks like that was the truth. Can't think he had too many visitors here. After several more such rooms, Zael at last came across a set of stone steps leading down. Unable to see the bottom, the necromancer proceeded with even more caution, the dagger ahead of him and a spell upon his lips. Fortunately, no trap or demon struck. At the end of the stairway, he found a short corridor ending in three closed doors, one in front of the others flanking him. A quick study revealed all to be identical, and when Zael had the skull look them over, Humbart informed him that none of them had any sort of ward in place. I'm reminded of a story about an adventurer, the skull went on while the necromancer considered his choice. He came across three such doors, Now, he had been told that two doors led to treasure and escape, while the third held certain horrible death. While the lad gave it some thought, listened at the doors, and finally made his choice. Zael, just on the point of picking the one to his left, noticed Humbart's sudden silence. And so, what happened? Why, he opened one and got himself eaten alive by a pack of ghouls, of course. As it turns out, none of the doors led to gold or safety, and all of them, in fact, had monstrous, grisly ends waiting for those who— Shut up, Humbart. Even though the skull had not seen any wards, Zael did not assume the entranceways were free of risk. Placing his unliving companion back in the pouch, he readied himself for any trap its opening the first door might spring. A vast chamber full of dust and nothing more greeted him. Are you eaten yet? Came Humbart's muffled voice. The necromancer grimaced. Gregis Matzi might have taken over what had been left of the old monastery, but he had not made much use of it. Perhaps, Zael thought, he would have been better off searching through the outer rooms first after all. Looking at the remaining two doors, he chose the first of the pair. Surely the door faced by Eddie who came down the steps had to be the one. Steeling himself against Zael pushed it open. Row upon row of half-rotted tables spread out before him, and a looming archangel with one hand held forward in blessing seemed to reach out from the wall on the far side. Zael swore under his breath, realizing that he had found where the monks had met for their meals. From the looks of everything, it was yet another chamber not bothered much with the late Matzi. With little fanfare, he turned about and headed directly for one entrance left. Thrusting the glowing dagger before him, Zael barged in. An array of glassware and arcane objects greeted him from every direction, even the ceiling. Zael paused to drink it all in. Here now the world of Gregis Matzi began. Here, displayed before the necromancer, was the workplace of a man of intense interest in every aspect of his calling. With one sweep of the illuminated blade, Zael saw jars filled with herbs of every kind, pickled and preserved creatures the likes of which even the necromancer could not identify, and chemicals by the scores, in both powder and liquid form. There were racks of books and scrolls, open parchments with notes, and drawings atop of some of the tables, and even artifacts hung by chains from certain parts of the ceiling. Everything had a polished appearance to it, making it seem as if it had been only yesterday that the sorcerer had been at work here. The point, in fact, Zayo realized for this sanctum, it had only been a few days at most. The peculiarities of Limbo had once again preserved history. It must be very interesting out there, I suppose, Humbart called. Pulling the skull free, the necromancer placed it on the main table next to where Moxie had been making notes. Holding the dagger near, Zael looked over the writing. What is it? Spell patterns. Theoretical outcomes. This Gregis Moxie was a practical thinker. The necromancer frowned. Not what I would have expected of him. Evil can be very clever, if that's what you mean, lad. Zael studied the parchment in more detail. Yes, but all these notes concern only how to make the ascension to heaven possible. It is written as if by someone who truly believes in the quest. Giving the parchment one more glance, the necromancer turned to study the rest of the chamber again. As he held the dagger ahead of him, Zael saw that the room stretched farther back than he had initially imagined. In the dim light, he could make out more shelves, more jars. Here, now. You're not gonna leave me alone, are you? You will be fine, Humbar, says the one with the legs. Disregarding the skull's protest, Zael moved farther into Gregus Mazi's sanctum. From container after container, creatures long dead stared back at him with bulbous, unseeing eyes. A black and crimson spider, larger than his head, floated in a thick, gooey mixture. There were young sand maggots, and even a fetish, one of the sinister cannibalistic denizens of the jungle, doll-like in appearance, but with a totem mask face. They hid among the trees and thick foliage, seeking to take down the unwary by numbers. Necromancers destroyed them wherever they found the foul creatures, for nothing but evil came from them. Zael? Lad? You still alive there? I'm still here, Humbart. I. And so am I. But it's not like I've got so much choice in that respect. One specimen in particular caught the necromancer's attention. At first, he thought it a square sample of skin, perhaps even from one of the tentacle beasts in the jungle rivers. Yet, as he peered closely at the gray, hand-sized patch, he saw that on each corner there were three tiny but very sharp claws, and in the center what might have been a mouth of sorts. Slight bits of fur also seemed evident near the edges of the form. Curious about this oddity, Zael took the jar down, placing it on the nearest table. What's that you got there, boy? I heard glass clink. Nothing to concern yourself with. The necromancer removed the lid. Then, after locating a pair of tongs, no doubt used just for such a purpose, fished for the specimen. He pulled the bizarre creature free of the soupy liquid, letting residue drip back into the container as he used the dagger to steady it up close. I don't like to complain, boy, but are you going to investigate every damn jar? Zael glanced over his shoulder at the barely seen skull. I will not be long. A hiss suddenly arose from the container. The tongs were pulled from his hand, and something massive tried to wrap itself over the top half of his body. Zael! Zael, lad! The necromancer could not answer. A dripping, pulsating form with hide like an alligator covered his face, shoulders, and most of one arm. Zael cried out as what felt like daggers thrust into his back, tearing through his garments as if they were nothing. Teeth, jagged teeth, tore at his chest. Blatantly, he realized that he had also lost the dagger. Zael tried to speak a spell, but could barely breathe, much less talk. The force of his monstrous attacker sent both tumbling to the floor. The shock of striking the stone surface almost did Zael in, but he held on, well aware that to give in to unconsciousness would mean certain, grisly death. The hissing grew louder, more fearsome, and, so it seemed, the monstrosity seeking to overwhelm him. Now the necromancer could feel it almost covering his body down to his hips. If the creature managed to enshroud him entirely, Zael knew well that he would be lost. With all his might, he struggled to push the moist, unsettling form up. As he did, though, the talons tore at his back, ripping through everything. The agony almost caused him to lose his grip. From without came a muffled, desperate voice of Humbart Wessel. Zael, lad, I can see a light. I think the blade by your left. Just a few inches left. Using his weight, Zael sent both his attacker and himself sliding in that direction. He felt something near his shoulder, but then the tapestry-like aura shifted, causing the necromancer to move with it. Humbart shouted something else, but whatever it was became stifled by the thick, suffocating form atop Zael. More desperate now, Zael threw himself again to the left. This time, he felt the hilt of the dagger under his shoulder blade. Half smothered in danger of being eaten, he twisted to reach it with his right hand. The teeth clamped down on his forearm with such ferocity that the necromancer screamed. Nonetheless, Zael forced himself to continue reaching for the ivory dagger. His fingers touched the blade, and although he knew it would cause him more suffering, the injured spellcaster seized the weapon tightly by the sharp edges. Blood dripping from the cuts in his fingers, the necromancer brought the dagger up. At the same time, he muttered the quickest, surest spell at which he could think. A lance of pure bone thrust up from the dagger, flying unhindered through the thick hide of the beast, tearing flesh and soaring upward until it struck the ceiling hard. Zael's horrific bow fluttered back, a strange keening sound escaping its bizarre mouth. Ichor spilled over the necromancer as it pulled away. As he dragged himself back, Zael gave thanks to the dragon Tragowl. The lance represented one of the talons of the mystical Leviathan who served as the closest thing the followers of Rathma had for a god. Among the most effective of the necromancer's battle spells, the bone lance had been summoned twice in the past by Zael, but never under such dire circumstances. However, despite its terrible injury, the tapestry creature seemed far from dying. Moving with swift, gliding motions, it rose up to the ceiling, then over to a corner. A slight shower of life fluid spilled onto the floor below it. Are you alright, lad? The skull made a peculiar noise, like the rushing of air out of pursed lips. Thank me when you've finished off that abominable rug. Zael nodded, raising the dagger toward the heavily breathing creature. He muttered another spell. Tragowl had helped him once. Perhaps the great dragon would grant him one more boon. A shower of bony projectiles, roughly the size of the dagger, formed from the air, shooting upward with astonishing swiftness. The thing near the ceiling had no chance to move without mercy. The needle-sharp projectiles ripped through its hard hide. A rain of blood, or whatever equivalent the monster possessed, splattered the necromancer, the sanctum, and one cursing skull. Now the creature keened loud and ragged. It tried to flee, but Zael had summoned the den drag, the teeth of the dragon Tragowl, and they struck so hard that they pincushioned the struggling form to the wall and ceiling. The movements of Zael's adversary grew weaker, sporadic. The flow of life fluid slowed. At last, the monster stilled. Zael! Zael! Called Humbart. Gods, wipe this slime off me. Quiet, Humbart. The necromancer gasped. Summoning the aid of Tragowl twice had taken much out of him. Had he been more prepared, it would have not been so. But the initial assault by the beast had left him weakened even before the first spell. As he tried to recoup his strength, Zael eyed the vast array of specimens Gregis Monsi he had collected over his life. The monster had been one small, seemingly dead sample among so many others. Did that mean that each of the sorcerer's collected rarities still had some life left in it? If so, Zael gave thanks that none of the shelves had been disturbed or their contents accidentally sent shattering on the floor. The necromancer doubted that he would have lived long, surviving in a room filled with dozens of strange and dire creatures. When his legs felt strong enough to trust, Zio returned to where the skull lay. A thick layer of yellowish ichor covered most of what remained of the light Humbart vessel. Taking the cleanest edge he could find on his cloak, the necromancer proceeded to wipe the skull as well as possible. Sometimes I wish you'd left me to rot where you found me, boy. You had already rotted away, Humbart, Zio pointed out, putting the skull on a clear part of the table. He looked around. Something on the wall to his right caught his attention. Ah, what? Not another of those beasts, is it? No. The pale figure walked to what he had noticed. Just a cloak, Humbart. Just a cloak. A cloak once worn by Gregus Matzi. Yet, it was not the garment itself that so intrigued Zael, but rather what he could find upon it. Under the light of the dagger, he carefully searched. There, with the utmost caution, the necromancer plucked 2 hairs from inside the collar region. Even better than clothing, strands of hair granted almost certain success when summoning a man's shade. You finally got what you want? Yes, these will help us call the sorcerer forth. Fine. It'll be good to see old Gregus after all this time. I hope he's looking better than I am. Surveying the chamber, Zael noticed a wide open area to the side of the entrance. As he neared, he saw that symbols had been etched into the floor there. How more appropriate and likely helpful than to summon the ghost of Gregus Masi, using the very focal point from which he had cast many of his own spells. Muttering under his breath, the necromancer knelt and began to draw new patterns on the floor. With the tip of his blade, as the point slowly drifted over the stone surface, it left in its wake the design Zael wanted. In the center of the new pattern, he placed the 2 hairs, moving carefully so as not to disturb them. Zael brought his free hand over, then, with a dagger, reopened one of the cuts he had suffered earlier. The barely sealed cut bled freely. 3 drops of crimson fell upon the hair. A greenish smoke arose wherever the blood touched the follicles. The necromancer began chanting. He uttered the name of Gregus Masi once, twice, and then a third time. Before him, the unsettling smoke swelled, and as it did, it took on a vaguely humanoid shape. I summon thee, Gregus Masi, Zael called in common tongue. I conjure thee. Knowledge is needed. Knowledge only you can supply. Come to meet Gregus Masi. Let your shade walk the mortal plane a time more. Let it return to this place of your past, by that which was once a very part of your being. I summon you forth. Now the smoke stood nearly as tall as a man, and in there appeared what might have been a figure clad in robes. Zael returned to chanting words of the forgotten language, the words that only spellcasters knew in this day and age. But just as success seemed near, just as the figure began to solidify, everything went awry. The billowing smoke abruptly dwindled, shrinking and shrinking before the necromancer's startled eyes. All semblance of a humanoid form vanished. The hairs curled, burning away as if tossed into hungry flames. No! Zael breathed. He stretched a hand toward his 2 prizes, and before he could touch them, they shriveled, leaving only ash in their wake. For several seconds, he knelt there, unable to do anything but stare at his failure. Only when Humbart finally spoke did the necromancer stir and rise. So, What happened there, lad? Still eyeing the pattern in the dust that had once been hair, Zio shook his head. I don't. He stopped, suddenly looking off into the darkness. Zio? I do know why I failed now, Humbart, the necromancer responded, still staring at nothing. It never had a chance to succeed from the first. It was doomed, and I never realized it. Would you mind speaking in less mystifying statements, lad? And explain for us, mere former mortals. Zael turned, eyes wide with understanding. It's very simple, Humbart. There is one, and one reason alone, that this would make this, and any summoning of Gregus Matsi, a futile gesture. He still lives.